Hey everyone, Pac MMA here again, and we're at the final pay-per-view of the year in UFC 323. I'll be breaking down the people's main event in Alexandre Pantoja versus Joshua Van. This is quite the tough one. Also, Dana White just announced a bunch of fights last night, and I'm not really going to talk about them, but I am just going to quickly make my disdain known for the 325 main event in Alexander Volkanovski versus Diego Lopez 2. That is one of the worst fights. It is one of the most disgusting fights I've ever seen in my life. I'm so abhorrently displeased. Someone find Dana. Someone do something. Like we need somebody to lock
Stop
Dana up
torturing
or
me.
something. I don't know.
Stop
Do
talking about
something
oiling
about
me
it.
up.
Anyway, let's get on to the actual meat and potatoes here. Also, happy Thanksgiving. Hopefully you guys had a good holiday. So yeah, let's get right into it. Joshua Van has pretty much broken through the title of prospect and has soared through the rankings, but Pantoja is far from an easy fight. Pantoja himself is paving his way to the greats. As per usual, I'll start with some specific strengths and weaknesses, yap about some context, and finally put all that analysis together and make a prediction. So let's start with Pantoja, the current UFC flyweight champion. Pantoja is sort of a notorious blockhead marauder. He is on a crazy warpath right now. He is extremely aggressive and has a weird, very static style of Muay Thai. If Raoni Barcelos is a mini Aldo, Pantoja is a mini Barcelos. Pantoja is also an aggressive grappler. He's really good at walking guys down with combinations, then shooting up against the fence. He's not like Merab, who can constantly shoot without being gassed, but Pantoja is very effective at using his pressure to force takedowns. And to add to that, he's got a solid submission threat and has recently gotten very good at taking the back from the body lock up against the cage. Versus Kai Kara France, he got the back pretty much immediately and threatened the arm triangle after transitioning. In the third round, Pantoja basically locks up the rear naked choke pretty shortly after getting the back. I'd say his submission threat is somewhat inconsistent. I think his comfort level to attack submission is based on how comfortable he is in a position. Like, the sooner he obtains a position, the more likely he is to explode into a submission. Another example of this was versus Asakura. He just straight up jumps on his back, starting from the cage with one hook in. That's sort of his bread and butter position. Up against the fence, threatening to hook a leg, or finishing more orthodox single and double legs from that body lock position. He actually does this trip to Kai Kara France twice, once in the first round and then in the third round before the finish, where he lifts his opponent, then sinks and sits back immediately to drag them down to more easily get both hooks in. Pantoja is quite the marauder, but that also has been to his detriment. Pantoja's overly aggressive style leads him to getting reckless and sloppy. He's been punished by sharper strikers like Urseg, who hasn't really been in the best form as of late, and I would say Moreno, but I'm not very high on Moreno at this point in his career either, but he did have some okay success versus Pantoja as well. On top of the bum rushing, Pantoja is also horrifically flat-footed. The reason why I say his Muay Thai is even less like Aldo than Barcelos is that he basically never uses teeps because he's so plotty on the feet. I wouldn't say that this is inherently a weakness, but more so something that can potentially hurt him in this fight is Pantoja's tendency to half-guard camp.
Guess we're going camping, because it's time to bring up Alexandre Pantoja, Mr. Half-Guard himself.
This was especially apparent in the second Royval fight, where that's basically what the entire fight was. I say this is somewhat of a weakness because Pantoja's cardio is also a bit questionable. Now, you may be calling me crazy because Pantoja has been in so many 5-rounders, but in Pantoja's most recent performance versus Kai Kara, he pretty much gasses and just lets Kai just kind of do whatever he wants at the end of the second round, and he is certainly fatigued, getting muscled around in the clinch by Kai Kara France. Like, he was most certainly gassing. Now, this definitely comes as a surprise since he went 5 hard, grueling rounds with Moreno, Urseg, and a pretty comfortable 5 versus Royval, but still 5 rounds nonetheless. So why did Pantoja gas in his most recent fight? Well, for one, he was going at a breakneck pace, so that could be a reason, but Pantoja fights are usually pretty high-paced. What I think is likely the reason for Pantoja fatiguing so quickly is that old age. Pantoja is technically not that old yet, but he's now 35, and I think his body is certainly feeling it, so I think it's something to factor in here. And the reason why I say that this is detrimental is because if Pantoja opts to smudge Van, he may not have the cardio to continue the smudge or keep it up in the later rounds. Alright, so let's move on to the bright new sprawling brawler on the scene, Joshua Van. Van has some of the best hands in the sport at the moment. Oh boy, I wonder where we've heard this before. He's got that slickness, that speed, a great jab, and arguably an even better left hook. To build on this point about his left hook, Van has great pull counters and defensive instinct. A weird thing on commentary I've noticed that they love to point out is Van's vision, but I think this is mainly paired with his great defensive instincts. He always usually leads with a parry into a pull or a shift of his shoulders, and typically he slams that left hook on the end of that defensive maneuver. So to review again, typically Van's reactive system goes lead parry, into pull, into counter. Beautiful technique that has worked for him consistently. In these videos, I always try to look for relevant strengths to the matchup in particular, and one thing that we see very reliably throughout his career is his urgency in the clinch. He's typically looking to dig up underhooks against the fence, and if he has the whizzer, he's quick to explode off the cage and circle back to the center and get straight back to work. Van also has solid sprawls as he's shown versus Durden, but then again, that's Durden, not Pantoja, so take it with a grain of salt. Van also has some of the best cardio at flyweight. I've never seen him slow down or give up an inch of pace. He's always working and spamming volume and keeping it sharp and technical. Here's some sneaky stuff. So Van's a great body puncher, pretty much finished Bruno Silva with body shots, and I think he also hurt Chaidez with body shots as well. I know that's not really relevant, but anyway. Van has also some solid kicks, using the lead teep very effectively to keep range, along with those calf kicks, man, and even putting a lead oblique kick into his arsenal versus Royval. Not that it'll be that relevant in a closed stance matchup versus Pantoja, but I thought it was worth at least a mention. He's got the youth, he's got that speed, that swag, so what are Van's weaknesses in this fight? Now, I guess I should point out that in these strengths and weaknesses segments, that these are pretty much purely from a tangible technique perspective, rather than sort of contextual factors, and that's a part of the next segment, so just to clarify. Van's biggest weakness is certainly his size for flyweight. He is considered small for flyweight, which is something you do not want to hear. A more technical weakness, I'd say, is that was definitely shown more prominently in his fight with Royval was his susceptibility to straight shots. Versus Royval and even Silva in moments, Van was getting caught by straight shots as his head movement tends to be that second line of his system's defense, as I mentioned earlier, and this includes knees. He just in general struggles moving his head against those straight shots. Against big meaty hooks and overhands, he's great at evading, but it's those straight shots that hit him square on. Defensively, he is also very prone to leg kicks, especially in a boxing heavy stance, alongside left side body kicks in both closed and open stances, as shown versus both Royval and Charles Johnson. I think Pantoja's switch kick is the de facto weapon here. Another hole in Van's striking is that he tends to throw kicks in solidarity, typically single strikes void of his boxing combinations. This can be a weakness as throwing them pretty much naked makes it easier for Pantoja to catch them and potentially take them down. So to add some stats to this matchup, Pantoja is currently 35 years old on an 8-fight win streak with 4 rear naked choke finishes and has fought a total of 17 UFC fights with a total of a 14-3 record in the UFC. Nothing too major to note here for Pantoja, just another fight for the long reigning champ, but he is definitely aging, which is probably the biggest thing to note here. In the case of Joshua Van, he's 24 years old, he is 8-1 in the UFC, and currently on a 4-fight win streak with only 1 finish over Bruno Silva in that time. I'd say that contextually, Van's activity is certainly going to help him here. He'll have had 4 fights by the end of this year, which is the reason why he's been propelled into title contention in the first place. We've seen time and time again that activity while on a win streak, unless you're like seriously compromised, can only really help you. In this case, that short-term fighting experience is hopefully going to make up for the lack of long-term experience compared to Pantoja, which I think is definitely the most detrimental piece of context for Josh Van here. The experience gap at the top is just immense. So who do I think is going to win this fight after all this? You know, I feel like it's so easy to just pick the grappler and typically the favorite going into these matchups, but I just want to do it. I want to pick Joshua Van here. I've picked Van in basically every single one of his fights, and I've been riding with him for a while, so you know what? Who cares about that pick rate? I'm going with the fearless Joshua Van. I think he will struggle with Pantoja's pressure and his kicks, in particular on the feet, but I do think Van's hands are clean enough and punishing enough to win rounds, and also he just has phenomenal cardio. Pantoja's getting older, and in my mind, slowing down against Kai Kara was very alarming. Also, I think Van's hands are not the same style as Steve Urseg's, but I think Van can punish Pantoja on the feet about as much as Urseg did. I worry that Van will just not be able to hurt the blockhead, the iron chin bulldozer Pantoja, but Van did sit Royval down in the waning seconds of his last fight, and maybe he can replicate that sooner against someone who is certainly more reckless on the feet compared to Royval. I think Pantoja is very very good, very seasoned, and can just stink it up and smudge the more inexperienced Van around. But I'm picking who I want to pick, and that's Josh Van, baby. I got Joshua Van by decision. Hopefully this fight lives up and it's not like the couple other big stinkers of the year. Thank you guys for watching. If you stuck through it all, if you enjoyed the breakdown, please subscribe. Tell me who you're picking and why. Is my prediction void of all logic? Please let me know. I know this time I'm basically just picking based on vibes, but how can I not? This is Pac MMA. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.